The Democratic People's Republic of Korea, commonly known as North Korea, is situated on the Korean peninsula just south of China and was founded in 1948 following its liberation from the Japanese Empire in 1945. Japanese control over Korea began in 1905 when it established a protectorate over the entire peninsula. Japan would then go on to formally annex the country in 1910. This annexation would last until 1945 following the Japanese defeat in World War II. In the aftermath of the war, the peninsula was divided into two, with the north being administered by the Soviet Union and the south being administered by the United States. Before the Soviets departed the country in 1948, they established a Soviet-backed government led by Kim Il-sung. Since the fall of the Japanese Empire and the subsequent rise to power of Kim Il-sung and his successors Kim Jong-il and Kim Jong-un, North Korean nationalism has been characterized by its desire to reunite the entire peninsula under North Korean rule, its xenophobia, and the personality cult that surrounds its leaders. The Japanese occupation of Korea during the early 20th century helped prompt an outburst of Korean nationalism that was focused in Seoul and Pyongyang, the peninsula's two largest cities. Korean nationalists during the early 1920s began to adopt Western ideas and institutions and blame the country's woes on the primitive heritage. However, by the late 1920s and early 1930s, Korean cultural nationalist thought began to shift. By this time, rather than rejecting the past, Korean nationalists began to embrace the uniqueness and importance of their heritage. This shift was most likely a result of the Japanese attempts to assimilate Koreans into a pan-Asian national identity. The rapid growth of both Korean and Japanese nationalism is greatly owed to the rise of print capitalism. Korean nationalism, however, was unable to compete with the Japanese propaganda machine. By the late 1930s, most of the prominent Korean nationalists fell in line with the Japanese regime. Although the late 1930s and early 1940s saw an increase in adherence to the Japanese model of nationalism by educated classes, many Koreans still cherish their cultural past. The Japanese nationalist propaganda during the occupation asserted that Koreans and Japanese shared the same ancient bloodline. According to the Japanese, both peoples belonged to an imperial race that was morally superior to all others. Rather than attempt to completely stamp out Korean identity, they instead attempted to co-opt it. While many Koreans in the educated classes fell in line with the Japanese view, most of the propaganda failed to reach the illiterate portion of the population, which formed a majority of the Koreans. While the educated began to identify with the pan-Asian style of nationalism that the Japanese propagated, the masses were often brutally forced into compliance with the Japanese demands. Following the end of the war, although most Koreans began to reject the Japanese imperialism that had existed during the occupation, they did not outright reject the nationalism that they had created, especially North Korea. The North Koreans kept the view of their race as most morally superior, but simply kicked the Japanese position out of it. In the North Korean view, while they may not be the strongest or the smartest, Koreans alone stood as the most moral race in the world. In the North Korean view, their inherent virtuous nature made them vulnerable, like children, to a world filled with evil and corruption. This new self-image caused North Koreans to look back on their history as one that had consisted of humiliation and abuse by foreign powers. The North Korean race-based worldview, as well as their self-image as inherently pure and vulnerable, would grow to greatly affect the way they viewed themselves, their leaders, and foreign powers. By reinventing their past, North Koreans were able to create a new identity for themselves. New nationalistic literature portrayed the Koreans as a suffering people who were rescued from the Japanese by the Soviets. The symbolism of the new nationalistic literature clearly portrayed the Soviets as a motherly figure and the Koreans as virtuous, victimized children. The success of the new Korean self-image can greatly be attributed to the Japanese schooled minority. It was the educated elites who were able to teach the peasants to read, send the nation's children to school, and placed radios in villages. Using these tools, they were able to convince the populace that they were the most pure race in the world. When the Soviets gained control of North Korea in 1945, they sought to orchestrate a people's revolution. They helped establish the Workers' Party and aided Kim Il-sung in assuming a leadership role in the country despite his lack of education and experience. The establishment of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea was accompanied by the establishment of a personality cult for Kim Il-sung and his successors. In order to establish legitimacy for Kim Il-sung and his regime, Korean nationalist thinkers reinvented his past and his identity, just as they had done with the Korean image itself earlier. They portrayed him as the embodiment of Koreanness, as well as a maternal, intellectual, revolutionary warrior. There was no mention of the fact that Kim Il-sung and his guerrillas barely fought the Japanese during the war, and instead spent most of their time in the Soviet countryside. Instead, it was proclaimed that he and his soldiers had fought the Japanese from a secret base on Mount Paektu, an important location in Korean national heritage. Propaganda created during Kim Il-sung's tenure as leader of North Korea also promoted his intellectual side. One of his top advisors, Hwang Chang-yop, created a political ideology for North Korea in 1972 that would later be attributed to Kim Il-sung himself. This ideology was called Juche thought. Juche thought states that the Korean masses are the masters of their own nation's revolution and construction. Since the 20th century and into the 21st century, several schools have been named after Kim Il-sung. His hometown has become a shrine, his birthday has become a national holiday, and statues of him have been erected across the country. Even after his death, he's still regarded as the eternal president of the republic. The personality cult established by Kim Il-sung and his regime was able to effectively allow him to rule his country until his death in 1994. The personality cult established by Kim Il-sung would in turn follow his son and successor Kim Jong-il. The media, the people, and the regime here worship them in a very similar way. Kim Jong-il was portrayed as a strong and militaristic leader who was capable of defending his nation from an evil and corrupt world. The personality cult maintained by Kim Jong-il is expected in turn to be maintained by his son and successor, Kim Jong-un, who took power in 2011 following his father's death. The personality cults exhibited by the Kims is directly related to the Korean self-image. Kim Il-sung, also known as the Great Leader, is said to derive his greatness and genius from his virtue and his purity, which are obviously integral parts of the Korean self-image. For North Koreans, the Great Leader embodied everything that was right about their race. Kim Jong-il, also known as the Dear Leader, is portrayed as a paternalistic figure that was capable of protecting his virtuous nation from an evil and corrupt outside world. The North Korean self-image is greatly intertwined with the way in which they view their leaders. North Korea's relationship with South Korea has proven to be an important issue for the populace of both nations for several decades. In June of 1950, the North invaded the South in an attempt to unite the peninsula under North Korean rule. The US and the UN would later join the war on the side of the South Koreans, while China would later join the war on the side of the North Koreans. The war resulted in an armistice with virtually no territory changing hands. The desire to reunite with the South still persists even today, but it is unclear whether this desire will lead to further hostilities between the two nations or diplomacy. The way in which North Koreans view the war clearly demonstrates the pervasiveness of their self-image and worldview. While most countries during the war viewed the North Koreans as bullies, they viewed themselves as liberators. In the North Korean view, the South went from being a Japanese colonial possession to an American one. They viewed the South Korean masses as their suffering brethren, and the elites in charge of South Korea as collaborators and traitors. The North Korean view is clearly portrayed in their name for the war, the Homeland Liberation War. The North Korean self-image is not limited to North Koreans alone, but extends to all Koreans. For the populace of North Korea, South Koreans are a virtuous people who are suffering at the hands of an evil foreign power. The North Korean self-image has not only affected the way they view their neighbors to the south, but other countries as well. During the Korean War, many North Koreans took a very xenophobic attitude towards not only their American enemies, but their Chinese allies as well. Many nationalistic writers during the war portrayed the Americans as a depraved race. In fact, one short story, named Jackals, told the tale of US missionaries who murdered a Korean child by injecting him with germs. This racial prejudice also began to extend to the Soviet Union. As the nation progressed, translations of foreign works became reduced, and Soviet plays became banned. Koreans who married Europeans, including Soviets, were often pressured into divorce. The true irony of their worldview is that while they berated and belittled outsiders, they simultaneously relied on them for aid. The blood-based nationalism that developed during the Japanese colonial period and was adopted after World War II by the North Korean people has come to greatly shape the North Korean view of the world, as well as themselves and their leaders. Although the country has opened up slightly more since the turn of the century, North Korean nationalism remains pervasive
and continues to shape the country today.